I want to try to give you a little bit of a sense of what I'm going to do tonight before I answer all of your questions. My book, The Promise, really tries to do three things. Tell you what happened, the backstory to these great events, these historic events, to give you some sense of what Barack Obama is like, since he's the most observed and least understood person on the planet, arguably, and only in a tertiary way to tell you how he did, because I think all of you can make your own judgments about that. It's pretty early for definitive judgments, but I wanted to give everybody more information on which to make their decisions, pull back the curtain and give people a sense of what was happening when the cameras were off, so that their assessment could be more informed by the facts. But I thought first I should tell you how I met Obama, and that was in 2002. My aunt, my mother's sister, Enid Long, died, and when we were sitting Shiva for her, my cousin Bob Rivkin, who went to Parker, said, well, you know, my friend Barack's going to come by. I said, great. He said, you still haven't written a column about him? I said, Bob, you know he's your friend, but he's an Illinois state senator, and Newsweek circulates in California and Timbuktu, and I'm not really that sure that they're that interested in your friend Barack, with all due respect. He said, well, you got to meet him. He's coming by. He's really smart. So Obama came by, and he was very smart. I thought he had a lot of chutzpah because he just lost for the House of Representatives, and he was telling me that he very well might run for the U.S. Senate. But we kind of stayed in touch, and not close touch, but I talked to him a couple of times. And then in 2004, after his famous convention speech, we decided at Newsweek to put him on the cover. It was the very first cover that Obama had been on. I went down from where I live in New Jersey to interview him. He was still technically a state senator, hadn't been sworn in yet to the U.S. Senate, but was becoming a national figure. I brought my son Tommy, who was then 13 years old. He's a big Chicago sports fan, and he really just wanted to go to Washington. He doesn't like it when I tell this part, to see the Bulls play the Wizards. But he figured that he would come along and listen to this new politician his dad was talking to. And afterward, he said, Dad, that guy, Barack Obama, he's going to be president in 2008. And I said, Tommy, when you've covered politics as long as I have, you'll know there's just simply no chance that could take place. Perhaps in 2016, but that's a long shot as well. He doesn't even know where the men's room is in the Senate yet. So fast forward to November of 2009, and I was on my way in to an interview with the president in the Oval Office, which, if anybody's interested, is bundled. The tape of it is bundled with the audio book of The Promise. And this part, the kind of pleasantries beforehand, are not on the tape, and it's not in the book. So I'm giving you some added value here, something that's not in the book. I don't like these books, The President Told Me, and that are all, so there's no first person in my book. But what happened was that I knew that there was a very short period of time for small talk. The president doesn't like small talk. He's a brass tacks guy. He's very charming in the small talk period, but it lasts about a minute 30, a minute 45, and then he says, okay, and it's unmistakable that it's time to talk about the business at hand. Talked to a couple of his cabinet secretaries who said that's one of the things they like, is that you don't have a lot of kind of BSing beforehand. So I knew I had about 2 minutes, and on the way into the Oval Office, I asked him a really imaginative question. So how was your Thanksgiving, Mr. President? He said, oh, we had a great time. We went with the whole family to the Oregon State George Washington University game, and my mother-in-law, though, the only problem is she kept punching me every time the game got close. His brother-in-law, Craig Robinson's the coach of Oregon State. Michelle's brother. And he kept punching me every time I got close. And I said, you're hurting me, and if you don't stop punching me, the Secret Service is going to haul you out of here. And so by this time, he's over in the wingback chair you see on TV in front of the fireplace. And I said, Mr. President, my son goes to George Washington, and he's actually going to be the assistant manager of the basketball team next year. And he goes, your son, that one I met? Like politicians can do this. I said, yeah. And then I told him an abbreviated version of the story that I just told you. He said, well, you tell Tommy two things. You say hello to him for me, and you tell him he should have talked me out of it. and then he said, joke, that's a joke. He was with the reporter. He wanted to make sure for the record that I didn't think he was unenthusiastic about being president. Then we went on to talk about Afghanistan and healthcare and the rest. And I thought I'd start tonight in terms of backstory, to give you a little bit of the backstory on Afghanistan, which is very much in the news this week, of course. This was not Stan McChrystal's first time at the woodshed. And I devote a chapter that I call, actually quoting McChrystal, Chaosistan, that details a drama that went on behind the scenes all last fall when we heard about some of these deliberations but didn't know too much about really anything about what I'm about to tell you at the time until the book came out. You might recall General McChrystal was on 60 Minutes last summer, and he was in Newsweek. He was on the cover of the New York Times Magazine, and he had just been appointed after the firing of General David McKiernan to take charge in Afghanistan, and he was arguing in all these broadcasts that we needed a open-ended, perhaps 10-year or more counterinsurgency commitment, the costs of which he didn't usually mention, but they were upwards of another $1 trillion in what was already about to become the longest war in American history. And there was only one problem with him doing all this publicity. The president hadn't decided on a policy yet and wasn't happy that it was making it seem as if he had. And so he put out the word that McChrystal and Petraeus and the rest of them were supposed to stop talking publicly, and Petraeus did. He called up an official at the National Security Council. He said, I get it. I get it, Dennis. We're not going to do this anymore. When I asked the president, were you jammed by the Pentagon, boxed in? His answer was, quote, I neither confirm nor deny that I was jammed by the Pentagon, unquote. You don't have to be in my business to know what that means. Unfortunately, McChrystal didn't get the memo. And he goes to London and gives a speech which has been cleared by Admiral Mullen, who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And in the Q&A after the speech, McChrystal is asked if he could support what's called a counterterror plan, the Biden plan, essentially. Vice President Biden was coming forward with an idea that we really should not send very many troops and just use Predator drones to go after al-Qaeda and not have a big nation-building effort. And McChrystal said, quote, not to be glib about it, but no. In the White House, they're going, wait, let's get this straight. The commanding general in the region is saying that if the president sides with the vice president, he can't support the policy. There's a word for that, insubordination. So Obama is in Copenhagen. You may recall that he was trying to get the Olympics for Chicago and failing. Michelle had been very involved in that, of course, and when he got back home and his aide said, did you really have to go? And he said, I had to go or Michelle would have killed me. So when he's in Copenhagen, he summons McChrystal, and there's a photograph of them on the tarmac on Air Force One. And he decides in that one-on-one meeting that McChrystal has been naive, not out of control, and that the real problem rests at a higher level, at the level of Petraeus and Mullen, who had been using McChrystal as their tool, or so the White House suspected. The White House, and this is very interesting given General Petraeus' new assignment, the White House at that time was worried that Petraeus might be a candidate for president in 2012. And when I asked Petraeus about it, he said, "What part of no don't they understand?" But he was seen as somebody who could possibly pose a threat, and they thought that he and Mullen were involved in boxing him in. So Obama summoned Mullen with Gates in attendance to the Oval Office. He dressed him down. He said, "I need to know here and now that this conduct will stop. You're doing a disservice to our men and women in uniform and to our country." He was described to me as being in a cold fury that day. And Mullen left the meeting chagrined, as I later learned. And the behavior did stop for about, I guess it's now 8 months, until this most recent incident. So I think the Rolling Stone article would have probably rolled off the president's back if it wasn't for this backstory of real tension over the formulation of policy. They had 20 hours of deliberations in the Situation Room, which I detail at some length because I think it's a wonderful case study in the way President Obama makes a decision. It was the most exhaustive policy process on a national security issue since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And I think it showed Obama at his best. I'm not sure about the results. I have my doubts about where they got to, but the policy was impressive. He and Biden essentially played good cop, bad cop. They went back over and over again at the Pentagon, questioning all of the assumptions that lay behind escalation in Afghanistan. Asked hundreds of questions. If the Taliban takes power in Kabul, does that threaten the command and control of nuclear weapons in Pakistan? If the Pakistani Taliban hooks up with the Afghan Taliban, does that give al-Qaeda more of a safe haven in the border regions, and so forth and so on, through a logic chain, as they call it, all the way down through a whole series of questions. They studied the Vietnam War, where in neither Vietnam nor in Iraq did they actually examine the issues, the assumptions behind the war. It was amazing, but the National Security Council did a study that confirmed what I had already known, which was that there was never such a meeting about either war. And when I interviewed the late Robert McNamara, I did the first print interview with him about the Vietnam War after he broke his long silence. And then later when I was interviewing him about Iraq, he focused on this. He said the key mistake was we never raised the critical issues and assumptions for proper and thorough debate. And so Obama was, as he told me, determined to slow everything down and come up with a more rational course. Now, the misunderstanding that he was trying to clarify just today was that the policy that he settled on was neither the Biden plan nor the McChrystal plan. It was McChrystal's plan in terms of the troop strength, but it was Biden's plan in terms of the duration. And he wanted a quick in, quick out strategy where we escalated very fast and then started to draw down beginning in July 2011. And when I was interviewing the vice president about this, and he, by the way, wanted someone fired, and later concluded that, as he said, they got the ticket in the right order, and he was glad that Obama was president and he wasn't, because Obama at that time decided it would be too disruptive to fire somebody. They just fired General McKiernan a few months earlier. There was a climactic meeting that I detail in the book in the Oval Office where the president made it clear that beginning to withdraw, that's a key word, in 2011 was an order. And Biden, on the way to the Oval Office, when they're walking down the colonnade, he asks the president, "Is this an order?" And he says, "Yes." And he goes in and he says, "I understand, Dave Petraeus and Mike Mullen, the chairman. I understand that you don't think this is the right thing to do, but I want to know whether you can complete this mission as we've outlined it. And they both said yes. And he said, okay, I want to make sure that we understand each other on this, that you believe this is achievable. But what we have now is essentially a new commander who, like the old commander, doesn't fully buy the mission. And this is a problem. I mean, he's committed to the president that he can carry it out, but things are not going well on the ground. They've suffered serious setbacks this year, and there's real questions as to what will happen next year. Secretary Gates got a caveat put into the policy that said conditions on the ground permitting, withdrawal conditions on the ground permitting. And the president clarified today that he wasn't turning out the lights in 2011. There are going to be some residual forces in Afghanistan, probably for the rest of our lives, like there are in Korea 60 years after the end of the Korean War. But they're not going to be, they're going to begin to rotate out in 2011. Most people in Washington don't believe it. I think they're serious about it, and it's partly because, and this was in a Wall Street Journal editorial this morning, Joe Biden said to me when I pushed him on it a little bit, he said, you're going to see a whole lot of people moving out beginning in July of 2011, bet on it. And then he said, I'm late for lunch with the president. He went to the door. I was standing there in his office, and he came back. He sort of half jogged back, and he's like a Labrador retriever, this vice president. He comes back and he like jams his finger in my chest and he says, bet on it. So he's determined, and he's not without influence. Obama didn't trust him at first. He excluded him from personnel meetings in the transition. But over time, they've developed a very good working relationship. And I wouldn't underestimate Biden's influence. Obama turned over Iraq policy to Biden, who visits Iraq once a month. Hillary Clinton was on the other side of this debate. She was with the Pentagon pretty much throughout. If she had been president, we would not have this in fast, out fast strategy. We would be staying there for the foreseeable future with a full coin campaign, counterinsurgency campaign, nation building. But they also have a good, strong working relationship. Neither the vice president nor the secretary of state have much of a personal relationship. It's a professional relationship. And I just heard today that Biden played golf with Obama for a second time. He had told me that he played with him once and he beat him with a 78, and the president never invited him to play again. He didn't seem to care, though. He said, Biden is nearly as profane as Rahm Emanuel. Are there any small children here? Can we go X-rated here a little bit? The whole Rambo chapter is all NC-17 for language. So, but Biden said, I don't give a shit whether the president invites me over. I could care less. And I think he means it. He's comfortable that he has his respect because Biden is very knowledgeable about foreign policy. He only seems like a blowhard. He's actually quite up to speed, and he is very useful for the president on Capitol Hill, especially in the Senate. Just a quick word on Rambo. He one day started yelling, I'm going to kill that fucking dog. And he was talking about Bo, the president's dog. So that dog is off message. They told me it was going to be a shelter dog, a mixed breed dog, like the president, who describes himself as a mutt sometimes. And they got a Portuguese water dog, purebred, from Ted Kennedy. And they lied. They said the dog would be trained, and the president spends half his time cleaning up dog shit. I said, he may have a Portuguese water dog, but he's also got a pit bull, and his name is Ram. So Ram is just a great, larger-than-life character who is dedicated to the president. Pete Rouse, who's the least known of the big four, Rahm, everybody calls him Rahm, like everybody calls Hillary. Rahm, Valerie Jarrett, David Axelrod, Pete Rouse. And Pete, who's the only one who's not from Chicago, who was Obama's chief of staff in the Senate, says Rahm is all about Barack Obama. But he has more temerity than anybody that you've ever met. When he was in the Clinton White House, he went up to Tony Blair as a young man, a young aide in the Clinton White House, just before Blair and Clinton went on stage, and he put his finger in the prime minister's chest and said, "Don't fuck it up." But he gets it done. Washington is full of people who talk and they posture and they have meetings where the main point of the meeting is to schedule the next meeting. And it's like in any community, it's like in the Parker faculty, there are 4 or 5 people who get it done, right? And if you need something done, you go to them. And Rahm has always been that person, and he's been a real asset. He had a big disagreement with the president on health care. Rahm told me, quote, "I begged the president not to do it." David Axelrod thought that they should do energy first. Joe Biden told Obama that he didn't owe it to the American people. They would give him a pass because of the condition of the economy. And so he didn't need to do health care in his first year. He had only promised to do it at the end of his first 4 years. Christina Romer, the chairwoman of the Council of Economic Advisors, she's an expert in Roosevelt, and she reminded him rightly that Roosevelt waited 2 years before he introduced Social Security. And by the way, a lot of liberals really didn't like the Social Security bill. They thought it was weak, watered down. It insured fewer than 40% of senior citizens. It was a racist bill because it was written so as to exclude African-American occupations from the original Social Security bill. But Roosevelt, like Obama, understood you've got to start somewhere. And so they did. And once the president decided, Rahm did everything he could to make it happen. He did say to him in the summer of 2009, when the polls had plummeted, and you remember those town meetings and the whole teabag thing started there, and you all didn't show up to the town meetings. Obama had said, we are the ones we've been waiting for during the campaign. Well, the we didn't turn out. They thought, okay, we've done our part. We've elected Barack Obama. Now we're on Miller time. It's up to him to get all this done. Our job is done. And Obama always said that wasn't the deal. But he did not get much support. When Reagan's popularity in 1982 was about where Obama's is now, almost exactly. And he got hurt in the 82 midterms. But the Republicans that year were going, stay the course, stay the course. And the Democrats are like wringing their hands. Is this the right course? And so some of it is these kind of differences between the parties. And even within the White House, there was a lot of nervousness. And so Rahm asked Obama in the summer, are you still feeling lucky, Mr. President? Because Obama always carries Lucky Charms in his pocket that he got on the campaign trail. And Obama said, look, guys, that's the way he likes to address his people. He says, my name is Barack Hussein Obama, and I'm sitting here, so hell yeah, I'm feeling lucky. So I don't think that he despairs of making a comeback, and presidents do have this ability to reinvent themselves. The lowest point was after the Massachusetts election to fill Ted Kennedy's seat. And about 2 weeks before that election, which took place on January 19th, the polls were starting to tighten a little bit. Martha Coakley, the Democrat, had a 17-point lead, but there was a new poll that showed things tightening. And Obama wanders down the hall to David Axelrod's office. Obama likes to manage by walking around. He's a very, very diligent student who always reads the briefing materials, always does his homework, but he's restless. And there's a picture in my book of him throwing a football in the Oval Office. And he'll just wander around. He'll wander into Rouse's office, and Pete Rouse is so unassuming that he didn't even show up at the inauguration. He watched it on TV, and he doesn't like to travel with the president, and Obama says that Pete so dislikes travel, he won't even travel down to the Oval Office to see him. He has to go and see Pete. And Axelrod, one day early on, I was sitting in Axelrod's office, and there's this skinny guy at the door, it's the president, he's wandering around. Other presidents don't do this. So on this day in January, early January of this year, he wanders into Axelrod's office, and Axelrod's reading the Boston Globe online. And he said, I want to read you something. When asked why she wasn't campaigning more with voters, Coakley replied, what, stand out in front of Fenway Park, shaking hands in the cold? I don't think so. Now, this was, they'd had a hockey game at Fenway the way they did at Wrigley, and Scott Brown had gone and campaigned there, and Coakley hadn't. And Fenway is like Wrigley, it's a shrine, people pray there in Massachusetts. And Obama, being a good politician, knew immediately that it was all over. And he grabs Axelrod by the shirt and he says, tell me she didn't say that. Tell me that's not true. Now, it was probably the most agitated that he got as president. People wonder, does he ever get angry? Although when he saw that Lloyd Blankfein, the chairman of Goldman Sachs, said they were never in danger of going under in the fall of 2008, when Tim Geithner, as head of the New York Fed, bailed them out, that was also a point of anger. But he, just to explain a little bit what he's like, the second objective of the book, I think everybody knows that he's like that old ad from the time I was at Parker for an underarm deodorant for women. I think it was called Ice Blue Secret, and their slogan was cool, calm, collected, Ice Blue Secret. And and that's Obama. He's always at a steady 60 degrees. Now the good thing about that is, unlike Bill Clinton, he doesn't rip your face off if you work for him. And I talked to a lot of people who had worked for Bill Clinton and for Barack Obama. And I have a whole chapter called The Un-Bubba, where I compare the two presidents. I didn't think the comparison to George W. Bush was as interesting, so I stuck with Clinton. And so Obama's cool, and he doesn't rip anybody's face off. Bill Clinton had what they called purple fits. But then after he cooled off and calmed down, he'd give you the warm embrace. I love you, man. I love you. And Obama doesn't do that. And I experienced that myself with Clinton in 1998. 1999. We hadn't had an interview with him for a long time because Newsweek, Michael Isikoff broke the Lewinsky scandal, and I had interviewed him a lot, and I finally got to him in a limo, presidential limo outside of Hartford. And when you're in my business and you get your chances, you have to go for it. So I said, Mr. President, are you going to seek psychiatric counseling for your problem? I can't believe you're asking me that question, John. I can't believe you're asking me that question. And he flipped out, and then he calmed down. And at the end of the interview, without saying goodbye, he gets out of the limo, and I'm sitting in there with the Secret Service. I'll never forget. It's like, 1, 2, 3. I'm sitting alone in the presidential. Finally, the 8-inch wide door opens, and I get out. But then, after he left the presidency, he gave me the first interview that he gave to anybody a year after he left the presidency. So he would you'd get the warm embrace later. If he said about me, he'd say, Alter bites me in the ass, but at least he knows what I'm. And so you'd kind of get back with him. Whereas with Obama, he doesn't flip out, but he also doesn't really give you that warm embrace afterward. He's a little shy in the gratitude department where he needs to be. Michelle has to remind him to show more gratitude. And that's people don't quite know where they stand with him. So when they get that icy glare, if there have been leaks, and he starts raging about leaks, which when he did would, pretty soon after it would leak to me that he was going crazy about leaks, he doesn't quite, he doesn't care what people think of him ultimately if he feels he's making the right decisions. He's not needy. And this is something that is both a great advantage for him and a great, arguably a disadvantage. It's an advantage because it allows him to get all those personal issues out of the way in his relationships with other people, the ego issues that are normally involved. And it saves a lot of time. There's not a lot of stray energy, as Tom Donilon, who, for all intents and purposes, runs the National Security Council and worked for Clinton as well, puts it. He's very focused and decisive, and when you're having a crisis, that's what you want. And he strips the emotion out of the equation in his private dealings with people and his decision-making, and he's very unsentimental in office. And that works great in the private part of the job, but then he sometimes neglects to reinsert that emotion in the public part of the job. And he said recently that the presidency, he said on the Today Show, the presidency is not theater, and I think the president is very wrong about that. The presidency's always been theater, always will be at least partly theater, and he needs to make more concessions to the demands of theater. But it was fascinating to learn how his mind works. Bill Clinton has what I call a inductive horizontal mind. Now, inductive reasoning, and I know this because I'm an inductive person, is sometimes a euphemism for disorganized thinking. He's quite brilliant at making connections between different things horizontally that don't seem like they're related to each other. But the ruminating, eventually the college bull session, particularly in his first term, made decision-making really hard. And he was called by many of his people privately the second guesser in chief. He was always going back. And so the contrast, say, between when he would select a Supreme Court nominee and Obama was night and day in terms of the discipline of the process. Obama is a vertical, deductive thinker, and he drills down into a problem step by logical step. Now, that doesn't guarantee the right result. And sometimes, a messy process can yield a good result, and I think Clinton had a lot of that. But it does give you a higher batting average. You're more likely to come up with a good decision if your process is sensible and thoughtful and methodical and asks the right questions. And so he's committed to making the process as sensible as possible. And that's an asset that he has. Now, in the midst of that, it's not all business. He likes to trash talk a little bit with his friends and kind of josh with his aides, and he likes to put Larry Summers in his place. I wish he would do more of that because I'm critical of Obama that he didn't use his leverage more over the banks when he had the opportunity to do so. He'll call Summers Dr. Kevorkian. What do you have to say? And actually, with Axelrod, Axelrod will say, well, what does your plutocrat constituency think about this, Larry? And Summers will say to Axelrod, I don't know, Che. Or Obama will tease Summers for sweating in wintertime or for sleeping in meetings. The only one with the moxie to use their BlackBerry in front of the president is Rahm. The rest of them, everybody else checks the BlackBerries in these cubbies at the door. I got interested in who was on Obama's BlackBerry. He made, I thought, a big mistake in reducing, during the campaign, a lot of people had his, maybe a number of people in this room, I'm sure, had his BlackBerry, his email address. And it was very good for him to hear from a lot of people. And he kept saying in the transition, I don't want to go into the bubble. The worst thing is to get cut off from the American people. He reads 10 letters a day from average people to stay plugged in. But the bureaucrats convinced him that he would cause problems with the paper flow of the staff secretary if he let people communicate with him too much independently. So he only has a small handful of people on his BlackBerry, under 20. Larry Summers wasn't even on the original list. Then he complained to Rahm, and he got on the list. The guy's got some sharp elbows that resulted in a blow-up with Christina Romer, where she was excluded from meetings, and Summers said, she said it was sexism, which was a serious charge for Summers because he left Harvard under a cloud of sexism, and he says, are you threatening me? And she says, are you bullying me? And she goes to Rahm, and she gets back into the room. But I like the staff stories of the squabbling between Hillary's people and Obama's. It's very interesting, but ultimately, it's less important than it was in, say, the Bush administration, because Obama is in charge, and it's very frustrating for him when the children argue. That's what you saw this week. He wants everybody to play well together and be adults, but he's making the decisions, and he's very on task. So a lot of this squabbling is not that important, but I do think that his circle is too tight. He doesn't have enough people with business experience in his inner circle, and particularly on the economy. He blocked Paul Volcker, who is probably the most distinguished Fed chairman in American history. And until the end of the year, he really didn't carry the day with his argument. Obama did call him and tell him why early on he wasn't siding with him. And for people who are interested in the economy, I try to outline what I think is a pretty dramatic story in preventing another Great Depression. A lot of liberals wanted Obama to nationalize the banks. We forget that was less than 18 months ago. The same way that New Deal liberals wanted Roosevelt to nationalize the banks. Both Obama and Roosevelt refused to do so, and they were both right. Sometimes the key decision is what you don't do. So Paul Krugman was wrong. He doesn't admit it, but it would have cost another $1 trillion, and there would have been bank runs, and it wasn't necessary. So in some areas, they were right. In other areas, not using their leverage to dictate terms to the banks when they had them over a barrel, I think was a mistake. Obama bought the argument of Tim Geithner and Larry Summers that the banks were too brittle to do that. And there was a case, and I try to present it fairly, but I think in that case they went in the wrong direction. So the policy choices are not going to be perfect, but he accomplished a lot more than people recognize. The stimulus bill was really 5 or 6 major pieces of legislation in one. They had to be quiet about it. At one point, a congressman saw Michelle Obama at a reception and said, recovery bill is the greatest anti-poverty program since the 60s, which is true. And she said, shh, shh, because if it looked like they were achieving certain social objectives, say on infrastructure, it was the biggest infrastructure bill since the 1950s, clean energy, it might look like they weren't focused enough on jobs. And that was a problem they had in terms of their communication all year long. They didn't convey that he was working on jobs. And of course, the health care bill was the greatest piece of social legislation since 1965 in the enactment of Medicare and Medicaid. So the record as a whole, about 500 promises he made. And he, according to PolitiFact, which is a neutral, nonpartisan, Pulitzer Prize-winning website, he achieved or made progress on 385 out of 500 by the end of 2009. And by this point, I don't know what the figure is, but it's well into the 400s. Did they get that message out? No, obviously not. Do they have problems communicating their message amid the cacophony of voices? I think so, and we can talk about that more if you want. Part of it is what I refer to as his role as professor-in-chief. He hasn't found the right key in which to communicate with the American public. And so we expected him to ace communications and struggle in executive leadership because he had no experience. But it turned out that the silver-tongued orator actually struggled in communication and did very well behind closed doors, which is most of what I'm interested in the promise. I wanted to tell you one more story before we get to questions. What do we have, another 20 minutes or so? I hope so. Just to give you a sense of the way he operates behind closed doors. You remember the Copenhagen climate change conference, which didn't get very much accomplished, but they salvaged something. At first, it looked like it was so draped in failure that Obama wasn't even going to go. And then the critics said, look, you go to Copenhagen to get the Olympics for Chicago, you can't go to Copenhagen to save the planet? You know, come on. So Hillary had been there for 11 days, and she hadn't been very successful. Just a word about Hillary. She, when Obama chose her, his people didn't want her, obviously. And he said at one point, he said, look, guys, she's the most qualified, okay? End of debate. But she was very frustrated, and Obama shows up on the last day of the conference, and mostly he wants to meet with Premier Wen of China, who he had seen a few weeks earlier in Beijing. They had had a good conversation on climate change, and he met with Medvedev, and they made progress on the START negotiations, which ended in an important New START arms control agreement a few months later. But mostly wanted to see if he could advance the ball with Premier Wen. He was having a very hard time getting it scheduled. It looked like the whole conference was going to blow up. Prime Minister Singh, rumor had it, had already left for the airport, Prime Minister of India. The other developing nations were angry at the developed world because they thought, you all got to use fossil fuels to build your economies in the 19th and 20th century, and now you're saying to us, we're developing, and suddenly we can't, use coal and oil. And the developed countries decided that to salvage something, they would try to at least get a registry, a public registry, so there was elemental transparency that hadn't existed before, and that the Chinese, for instance, would have to list their carbon emissions. So at least people looking at this would have more information to work with. And a very important first step, not the carbon emission standards that environmentalists hope for, which aren't possible until the US Congress acts and other things happen, but a beginning. So he wants to meet with Premier Wen, and the advance team goes into the room that the meeting's supposed to take place in. And they see that there's a meeting going on in this room, in this abandoned shopping mall in Copenhagen. And Premier Wen is there, and Prime Minister Singh didn't go to the airport. He's still there. And so is Prime Minister Zuma of South Africa and Lula of Brazil. So Obama says, we're crashing. And he just walks into the meeting, and Premier Wen has a sidekick named Minister Xi, who's the environment minister in China. And he sees the President of the United States walking in, he says, "Ow, ow," in some mixture of Chinese and English. And Obama ignores this, he walks in, and he goes, "Hey, Lula, what's up? My friend Lula. There are no chairs here. No chairs. Oh, Mr. President, here's a chair. Okay, I'm going to come pull up a chair with my friend Lula." And Hillary is with him and two aides. None of this, there were 1,000 reporters at the conference, and none of this was obtainable to them. And I didn't go to the conference, but a few months later, I was able to circle back and find out what happened in the key meeting. They proceed to have about 90 minutes of negotiations on this registry, and it's going very well. And they're getting down to the short strokes, and Hillary's negotiating, and they're pretty close to an agreement. And suddenly, Mr. Xi starts shrieking at Premier Wen in Chinese, shrieking. And everybody looks at the interpreter, heads of state look at the interpreter, and then Premier Wen says something in Chinese to the interpreter, and the interpreter says, "For internal use only, internal discussion only." So Obama, without missing a beat, goes, "I'll take that to mean we have an agreement," and he hikes out of the room. So I think that gives you, some sense of the way he operates. Obviously, he's got his challenges in dealing with arguably the worst hand that any president's been dealt since Franklin Roosevelt in 1933. The only real comparisons in terms of transitions are Abraham Lincoln in 1860, 1861, and FDR in 32, 33. And he said to me at one point, "You know that you've got a full plate when an H1N1 pandemic is 6th or 7th on your to-do list." So there's kind of water coming over the side of the boat all the time. And I think one of the reasons he moved forward with healthcare so aggressively was that he wanted to do something that he wanted to do, and not just clean up President Bush's messes. And really, he's what Ronald Reagan's chief of staff, Don Regan, called the captain of the shovel brigade, cleaning up after the elephants at the end of the circus, whether it was the banks, the auto companies. By the way, 75% of the $700 billion in TARP money has been paid back already, and most of the rest of it was to the auto companies, and that has gone much better than anybody would have thought. If GM had liquidated, we would likely have had a depression. Banks, auto companies, Afghanistan was a lot worse than he expected. And the BP oil spill is really just a perfect metaphor for what Obama was faced with. It was at least the indirect result, if it hadn't been that accident, it would have been another one, of ridiculously lax regulation. Now, Obama didn't straighten it out as fast as he could, but he did fire the Denver office of the Minerals Management Service. In the Denver office, the regulators were not figuratively, but literally sleeping with the representatives of the oil and gas industry and watching porn with them. Again, I'm not making this up. But he didn't move in a sweeping enough way to change this culture, the same culture of industry lackeys that began under Ronald Reagan, and we've had about a 30-year cycle of deregulation, where deregulation became a rallying cry. I think deregulation now needs to be an epithet, because the BP spill is a direct consequence of not having effective emergency plans. Do you know that the oil company's emergency plan, they had the same wildlife expert in all of their emergency plans, and it turned out the guy had died in 2005, and he's still on their emergency plan. They had walruses and others on their Gulf of Mexico spill contingency plans as if it was in Alaska where the spill. And all of this is their responsibility, but also something that regulators should be on top of. If the blowout preventer, wasn't properly supervised, it wasn't going to work. And they needed many more redundancies. They were drilling a mile beneath the ocean floor. Now, Obama is going to be in trouble politically until they cap that well. And he can't dive down like Aquaman, a mile beneath the surface and with his bare hands, cap the well. But he's going to suffer until they get it capped. And then at that point, I think if they can get on top of the cleanup, and the $20 billion from BP was a start, and I think the American people liked hearing about that. If they can get on top of it, then they might be able to turn this around and neutralize it, or even make some hay of it. It came out this week that the chairman, the ranking member of the House Energy Committee is this guy you now have heard of named Joe Barton, who said that he apologized in prepared remarks. He apologized to BP and said that $20 billion liability fund that Obama extracted for them was a shakedown. I thought there was a little bit of a racial subtext there. It was a little bit like, remember when Jesse Jackson would go to Jewel Foods and he'd say, if you don't hire more African Americans, and a lot of people say, well, that's Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton shakedown. It was like he was accusing Obama of this. He preferred, with the status quo, $75 million liability fund. That's a bar bill for these guys, right? They're making $6 billion in quarterly profits. So the Republicans announced yesterday that if they take control, Barton becomes chairman of House Energy. They're not going to strip him of his seniority. So the Democrats, I think, they can find a way to, if they can't, they should go into another line of work. They can find a way to depict the Republicans as the party of big oil. 100 Republican members of the House are members of the Republican Policy Study Group, which endorsed used the shakedown language before Barton did in a paper. So there are real divisions here. I call it a division between the 19th century and the 21st century. The 19th century is fossil fuels. The 21st century is clean energy. We can't get there right away, but Obama has the potential to use the BP spill the way Bush used 9/11 to totally transform American foreign policy. And it almost turned on 9/11. Everything turned on the war on terror after 9/11. And one hopes that Obama can use this oil spill to at least begin to put a price on carbon, very important, and move us toward a clean energy future. There are 100 ways for him to fail. And this time that we're in is treacherous for any president. But I think people would be making a mistake to underestimate Barack Obama. He's had low moments before where liberals wring their hands about, is he an effective enough candidate? Is he going to lose to Hillary? Is he going to lose to McCain? And he has complete faith in his ability to hit the three-point jumper at the buzzer. Too much faith, arguably, because even Michael Jordan, his hero, missed sometimes at the buzzer. But he does have an ability to rise to the occasion. And I think that he still has the capacity to further redeem his promise and be a great president.